Thanks. So why we're here. Our class goals for day one are to get an overview of the NFIP and flood insurance rate maps in the first hour, and then in the second hour, we'll look at the floodplain management ordinance and those regulations. We'll go a little bit over permitting and then the construction requirements. And then tomorrow we'll look more into permitting and the substantial damage and improvement regulations, and then dealing with violations and our auditing process as it stands. So today's goals, the history and common terminology that we use in the NFIP, where some of those resources are, the mapping, so that's the flood insurance rate maps, and then base flood elevations and letters of map change. So the NFIP, or the National Flood Insurance Program, is aimed at reducing future flood damage and protecting property owners from flood damage. So they've kind of set it up as a four-legged stool of the NFIP. So you have the flood hazard mapping, so we know where the risk is located. We have the flood insurance arm of the program that provides flood insurance to those in the floodplain and those outside of the floodplain as well. In participating communities, we have floodplain management, so that's the regulations that are enforced and the permitting that is done to make sure that new construction is built safely, and then mitigation grants. So we have pre-disaster and post-disaster hazard mitigation grants through FEMA and the NFIP. So this starts back in 1965 when we had Hurricane Betsy. So we've always had large destructive storms on the coast. And so this was the first hurricane that had damages totaling over $1 billion. And so it was nicknamed $1 Billion Betsy. And this led private insurers to lobby Congress to get into flood insurance. So they wanted to establish a national program that would provide people with flood insurance. And so it came into existence, the establishment of the NFIP, as a result of this hurricane. And following this, they also built new levees in New Orleans that were designed to resist a Category 3 hurricane like Betsy. However, those improvements failed during Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which was a Category 5 that made landfall near New Orleans that year in August. And so the National Flood Insurance Act, as I said, was established in 1968. And so it is a federally subsidized flood insurance program, basically, that was made to make insurance available to communities that voluntarily enacted these land use and control measures. And so it's in exchange for regulating your floodplain. Flood insurance is then made available. And so prior to 1968 and the establishment of the NFIP, the only relief that people were able to get was special disaster loans. And that was not sustainable. And the result of these disasters and flooding was a large expense to the federal government. And so following all of that and the establishment of the program, we had Hurricane Agnes in 1972. And this was a large hurricane that destroyed thousands of structures and caused a lot of damage, over 43,000 structures in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And if you look at the track, it did make landfall twice. And so in all of that destruction, only 13 of those structures were insured. So less than 1% of the damage was covered. And this was a $2 to $3 billion damages accumulatively and over 100 fatalities. And so following this, in 1973, the Flood Disaster Protection Act was established. And this is because early participation since 1968 in the program was very low, but then we had the impacts from Hurricane Agnes, and so that's what led to the establishment of this act that now requires homeowners in these high-risk flood zones, which is the Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA, with a federally backed mortgage, are now required to purchase flood insurance. And so that is still in effect to today. And so FEMA was established in 1979, and so the NFIP was originally under HUD, or the Housing and Urban Development Department, and then in the 1980s it was transferred to FEMA. And so in addition to having the NFIP under FEMA, they established the Write Your Own, or WYO program since 1973. So basically it's cooperation with the private insurance industry. So 50 companies are currently participating in this, and basically they're able to write NFIP policies under their own names, those companies. So they do all of the work to write and establish policies and do all of the work through these private insurance providers. And then FEMA, funds that and writes the checks for those payouts. So there is a site that lists all the different flood insurance companies throughout each state through that link. So FEMA and the KDA DWR partnership. So FEMA's mission is to help people before, during, and after disasters. And so we are the state component of that as far as our 2 grants that we have on the floodplain team. So we partner with FEMA to manage 2 of their grants. So the first one, we have CTP. This is the Cooperating Technical Partners grants. And so this is where our mapping team comes in. It funds the majority of the mapping work across the state of Kansas. And it supports our technical assistance program. So our mapping team works with contractors to do the mapping across the state, and then they also have the technical assistance program where communities can apply to those. And then we work with contractors to do studies on different mitigation options and what the outcome of those can be. And then those projects can then support an application for a mitigation grant. And then the Community Assistance Program, or CAP grant, which is what I manage, is a grant that supports community and public education for NFIP rules. So we support communities in their participation in the NFIP, getting into the program and adopting maps and enforcing those regulations, where we help on the education side of that. And then we also have KDEM, or the Division of Emergency Management, and they administer those hazard mitigation grants. And so we do work with them quite a bit. We're adjacent to them. We do coordinate through the Kansas Hazard Mitigation Team. And, we work together on any disasters that might happen. And so they would be the boots on the ground initially for any disaster that might happen. So yeah, they manage the pre and post disaster HMA grants, and then the disaster response. And so this is our team. So that's me and Caitlin on the right for under the CAP grants, and then we have our mapping folks on the left side there, except Bill, who has left the team, but we have Keegan and Joanna there who work under the CTP grant. And so just continuing with more billion-dollar disasters. So this is something that has just been increasing over the last several decades. And we've had significant increase in both the frequency and the cost of disasters. So we have the graph here that shows from 2003 to 2022 compared to the previous 20-year period from 1983 to 2002. So you have 1983 to 2002 there in red, and then 2003 to 2022 in blue. And so it's just gone up pretty exponentially. So 96 disasters caused more than $546.3 billion in damages and other costs, and it rose to 244 events and more than 1.95 trillion in costs in the subsequent 20 years. So that's a 154% increase in the number of billion-dollar disasters, and a 257% surge in costs. So it's definitely very prevalent and it's not getting better. So that's why our work is so important. So Hurricane Harvey in 2017 hit Hitchcock and Houston in Texas. And they weren't just damaged by the force of that, there were also outdated maps in these areas. So at that time, those maps hadn't been updated since 1983. And so the risk was not properly reflected. And so the regulations that may have prevented some of the damage were not able to be enforced because the maps are that regulatory product. So many areas that were at risk were not shown to be within the special flood hazard area. And so that was devastating. And then just recently last year, we had Hurricanes Helene and Milton in very quick succession. So Milton is estimated to have caused between 160 and 175 billion dollars in October, and then Helene between 225 and 250 billion back in September. And so there's been $860 million that was approved for survivors and communities. And of course, now we're seeing the wildfires in the Los Angeles Palisades area that could definitely lead to flood after fire. So they've already had some mudslide damages after the fires destabled some of the hillsides. And of course, flood after fire is a big problem as the ground has been compromised. There's no vegetation to absorb water. And February is the wettest month next month coming up for Los Angeles. So it'd be interesting to see what happens there. But basically, these large-scale catastrophic disasters are just increasing as we go forward. And so, again, that's why our work is important. So the community role and participation in the NFIP. So again, the goals of the NFIP are to reduce the loss of life and property that is caused by flooding. We want to reduce the cost of disaster relief caused by flooding, provide flood insurance, and then encourage wise use of the floodplain. So the benefits of the NFIP for communities that join, those property owners anywhere in the community, doesn't have to be in the special flood hazard area. Anyone can buy flood insurance through the NFIP. It's also part of eligibility for those federal grants that I mentioned for the HMA grants, and probably through other funding sources as well. They'd probably want you to be in the NFIP if you have special flood hazard areas. And those are for loans for development, grants or loans for development to, again, pre or post-disaster. Disaster assistance is limited for communities that don't participate in the NFIP. So to get the full benefits of federal disaster assistance, you have to participate in the NFIP to recover and assist with those damages caused by a flood. And then enforcement of the ordinance leads to better development against flood risk. So it ensures that things built are reasonably safe from flooding. So participation in the NFIP is voluntary, and to participate, you have to adopt your effective FIRM or flood insurance rate map. So there are communities without maps, but if you do have a map, then you have to adopt it to join the program. And in exchange for that, federal flood insurance is available to all property owners throughout that community. And so in the ordinance that you adopt and regulate to, you name who is the floodplain administrator. So this is a community official, and that title carries with it the duties of the floodplain administrator, who does all the permitting and works with us through audits and would be the CRS coordinator if you join that program as well. And we'll talk about that. But there's a lot of different titles that have been given the role of the floodplain administrator. So in smaller communities, it's often the city clerk. In larger communities, it's often the engineer or a planner. The planning and zoning administrator is very common. Sometimes it's the mayor. It just depends on how the community thinks it will function best, but those duties can also be delegated to another person that's not officially the floodplain administrator, but takes on those duties. But that person who's named in the ordinance is the official floodplain administrator. And then what zones you have in your community determines what areas have to be regulated. So typically the regulations only apply to the mapped floodplain. You can go above and beyond that and adopt other types of areas, but that is the required minimum, is that the mapped special flood hazard area is regulated. There's also a resolution of intent to participate in the program, which basically acknowledges that you have these areas of flood risk and that you wish to participate in the program. So it's a very simple process. The actual floodplain ordinance is a little bit longer process, but I work with communities all the time to go through that and adopt the ordinance. And then lastly, we have an application form for participation, which names the CEO, which is often the mayor or the chairman of the board of county commissioners, where your map repository will be located for hard cover or hard copies of the map, and just general community information. And then I get all of that and submit it to FEMA for enrollment in the program. So doing education and outreach once you are in the program and making people aware of the areas of risk and what's required to develop those areas is really important. And so the best way to avoid violations in the future and putting people and structures at risk and, where they're not supposed to be or in an incorrect way is by educating residents who reside in the SFHA and making them aware of the need to obtain floodplain development permits. So in the special flood hazard area to develop, in addition to any building permits or other permits that they might need to get, there's a specific and separate special flood hazard or special floodplain permit that is required. It can be made into part of a building permit, but it is separate information that needs to be verified, and that corresponds to the ordinance specifications. So we do have a letter template that can be used to mail residents, and we typically recommend mailing this out once a year to all your addresses that are located in the floodplain so that they can't really say that they didn't know or weren't made aware of this. If you're at least doing those notifications, and then of course using the community website and social media or any other way that you can make people aware of the risks and the requirement for permits. So you can find that on our NFIP community resources page. I will probably follow up both of these classes with an email that contains some of these resources and definitely a link to that page, but we have quite a bit of outreach and other templates and handouts on that page. So the CRS, which I mentioned briefly, the Community Rating System program is an incentive program that is voluntary and it goes on top of the NFIP. So it's a little bit separate program that's contained within the NFIP. And so basically communities will take on some additional floodplain management practices that exceed the minimum requirements of the federal and state requirements. So once you do that, you put together a program and you earn points. And then depending on how many points you're able to put together in your program will determine what class level you're in. And so we usually recommend communities get in at a class 9 and then fill out the program. If you like it, you can stay and improve. So at a class 9, that's a 5% discount. 8 is a 10% discount, and then so on and so forth. The lower your class number is, the more points you have, and the more people get discounts on their flood insurance premiums. And so the lowest we have in Kansas is Lenexa at a class 6. And so it's political goodwill for your community if you can prove that work that you're doing is earning people discounts on insurance, and going above and beyond the minimums ensures that your citizens are safer by doing outreach, by adopting higher standards, and there's a full suite of activities that you can do to earn those points. So they're discounted, and then you reduce the risk by your efforts to improve your floodplain management program. And then that avoids flood damage to insurable property. So we have quite a few communities in Kansas that participate. We have over 400. And so there has been a national trend that NFIP policies have just been getting dropped due to price increases and kind of a continued lack of clarity through the risk rating program. But currently we have 4,727 flood insurance policies. So we have over $1 billion in coverage. Premiums total is 5,385,207. So that's the total for all of the counties in Kansas. We've had 7,800 claims since 1978, and then 109 million paid out since 1978. So those are just some insurance stats. Again, it's a national trend that they've been decreasing and getting dropped, which is unfortunate because of the scale of disasters that we've been seeing over the years. And like in 2019, we had widespread flash flooding in Kansas. So, but I understand that there's a little disconnect between regulations and now flood insurance, and also just the increase in premiums. So floodplain mapping. So over the past 30 years, flooding has been more dangerous in the US than any other weather-related problem. So to minimize damage, we have to understand where the risk is. So that's why we've been working to map all the communities and counties throughout Kansas, but it has been taking time. And that's the same for many other states. There is an effort that has been promoted through FEMA to map the entire country. There is kind of a lack of maps in certain areas throughout the West. A lot of that is the case. It takes a long time and it's very expensive, but we do need to get those risks mapped. So about 2/3 of FEMA maps have an effective date greater than 5 years ago. And the process takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years for a single countywide map. And some areas have effective firms from over 40 years ago. And I know that's definitely the case here. We still have quite a few areas that still have paper maps or don't have a map at all. But yeah, we are still working to get that done. You know, we do work throughout every year to create new maps. And so why do we need maps? To understand the risks so you can make informed planning decisions and avoid future flood damage in your community. Determine where flood insurance is required. Again, if you have a federally backed mortgage in the mapped special flood hazard area, there is a mandatory purchase requirement. And then provide the basis for updating floodplain ordinances. So those are your tool for reducing your community's vulnerability to flood risk, and the ordinance gets updated to adopt new maps. But if it's been over 10 years, we do require that you have a full update to the map, or to the ordinance, excuse me. And we updated our ordinances back in 2023. So if your ordinance is older than that, you might consider updating it. And again, we've been working with like 4 or 5 different counties currently to update their ordinances and adopt their new maps. So just looking into how we do the mapping just a little bit, we have hydrology and hydraulics. And so hydrology is how much water is going to be there during that flood event, the flood frequency, depending on what we're looking at. And then hydraulics is how high will the water get, depending on how it moves through the environment. And so again, hydrology, how much? So the peak discharge is determined for various flood events, so the different levels of flood events. So we can use a gauge analysis or a regression to study that. And so we map the 100-year floodplain or the 1% annual chance flood for the regulatory purposes. And so that is the national standard, and it's a compromise to let people develop these areas, but also to make sure that things are reasonably safe from flooding, and that's where the regulations apply. As part of the mapping process and those studies, the other frequencies or annual chance storm events are also documented or mapped even. So the 10%, 2%, 0.2% are often mapped, or they're at least part of the flood insurance study. So we do often see the 0.2% or 500-year flood mapped as part of the firm. And that way people know where that's located, and it's considered to be at moderate risk. And so we call it the shaded zone X, because it's not regulated, but it is considered, and it is considered as moderate risk. Whereas the 100-year flood is high risk. So the inflow hydrograph ran on grid within later versions of HEC-RAS or uses the HEC HMS model. So basically that's how things are modeled at this point. So we have the rain on grid 2D mapping going on versus where we had 1D mapping previously. Going forward, we have better modeling techniques and technologies. So it has changed over the years to be a little bit more accurate as much as we can be. So maps just get better as we go forwards. So again, hydraulics are how high the water gets. It determines where it goes and what the surface elevations are going to be for those various events. Again, most importantly, our 100-year regulatory event. And so whatever the 1% annual chance flood height is, that water surface elevation is called the base flood elevation, and that's used for our regulatory purposes. So again, we're using the HEC-RAS modeling software and then LiDAR topography to map that. Other inputs, we do have other data sources that are integrated into these maps: the land use, soil types, structures such as culverts and bridges that would impact those hydraulics. And just looking at how our techniques have improved over time. So I said we're using LiDAR at this point in time, so you can see how that's reflected versus the 10-meter digital elevation model. So it's much more detailed, less pixelated, and it's just better data that will more accurately reflect our flood risk. And so looking at Kansas a little bit closer, this is where we have effective DFIR modeling and LiDAR as of October 2024. And so the goal is to create LiDAR-based digital flood insurance rate maps, or DFIRMs, based on LiDAR. And we still have areas that have paper map studies that are greater than 40 years old. So we are making progress for these other paper mapped counties. So we have moved forward since this. It depends on what our funding and priorities are. Of course, we would like to have the entire state mapped, but it is a very long process that takes a lot of funding. So we're limited there, and maps also have limitations. So The effective flood maps in Kansas only show riverine flooding and not flood or flash flooding or pluvial risk. So about 25% of all floods occur outside the floodplain. We have estimated about 49% of NFIP claims have been from outside the special flood hazard area. So again, anyone in a participating community can purchase an NFIP policy. You don't have to be in the special flood hazard area. So flood maps only show flooding for areas with 1 square mile of drainage or greater. And again, it takes about 3 to 5 years from start to finish to get that effective regulatory product. And so it's just limited on what we can do. And throughout this process, of course, we're always communicating with the county and all of the cities within the counties to get their input and feedback and talk about how this process works so that we have at least a product that is useful to them and that they can believe and trust reflects accurately. So what is the 2D base level engineering? So again, this is part of the newer 2D process. And so we do have base level engineering for the entire state. And so it's not at the regulatory level. It hasn't gone through all of those processes yet, but it is useful. And we're getting to the point where communities that don't have a map but do have the BLE, they'll be able to adopt this data and participate in the NFIP with at least a map that can be used to regulate and recognize where that risk is located. And so the HECRAS includes a robust 2D engine and is no longer limited to the 1D 6.0 infiltration options. So this allows for water movement in multiple directions and shows pluvial risk from rainfall. It looks at the entire area rather than a linear step-by-step computation. And so it's a mesh rather than cross sections. So it's not just along a specified stream. And then you can see that kind of in the top right, how it shows more detail. It's going to show more movement throughout the system. And then we have break lines that are used to realign and resize mesh cells along features such as roadways and stream banks. And so I'm not an engineer, I'm not on the mapping side either, but if you're interested in learning more about this, we definitely have training on the history and future of flood maps. That's on our website and recorded. We also have some of our contractors that have done presentations available there as well if you would like to understand this better. So the regulatory products, that's our flood insurance rate map and the flood insurance study that take 3 to 5 years to go through the entire process. But we do have these other non-regulatory products. So again, the base level engineering, it's a start. It hasn't gone through that full process, but it's still useful. We have depth grids, water surface elevation grids, velocity grids, and so many of those are just a lot more updated than some of the effective firms. If it's been more than 5 years since the effective date, we have updated risk data that can better inform a community available in some areas. So, if you're ever interested in that, let me know. FEMA has kind of promoted these non-regulatory products to just better inform communities. And so, we have been doing this work across Kansas, and you can see where our project status is for every county as of January 3rd of this year. And so, yeah, we've been getting some more counties through the preliminary stage and looking forward to the next communities to move forward through this process. So everyone's kind of at a different state of mapping at any given time. So we'll take a closer look at the firm and what it entails. So again, SFHA is special flood hazard area. So this is the 100-year floodplain. So it's the portion of the floodplain inundated by that base flood, which is the 1% annual chance flood as the national standard. So that is mapped out as Zone A, Zone AE, AH, AO, or AR, and we can go through those. A1 through 30 is an outdated way of mapping the A zone, but it is on some of the older maps that we have. So the area that we regulate through the floodplain management ordinance and where the mandatory purchase requirement for insurance applies. So the 1% annual chance flood, again, interchangeable with SFHA or the 100-year flood or the base flood, that all means the same thing. The area that will be inundated by the 100-year floodplain, sorry. Yeah, so all those terms are interchangeable. The base flood, again, it means the exact same thing. A 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year, and the regulatory standard. And then the base flood elevation is the elevation of that surface water in the base flood that has a 1% chance of equaling or exceeding that level in any given year. And the BFE is what we regulate to. And then floodway, so this is its own zone. The channel of the river or other water course and the adjacent land to that area that has to be reserved in order to discharge the base flood without cumulatively increasing the water surface elevation more than 1 foot. And so that's how it's mapped, so that it doesn't increase the base flood for more than 1 foot. And then this is where a no-rise certification is required for development. So if you want to develop an area that is in the floodway, you have to get an engineering study that proves that it will not increase the base flood to any amount. It has to be 0.0000, nothing. And so, yeah, that's how it's mapped, the base flood. So you have this whole area that is the special flood hazard area. That's the 100-year floodplain. So you see the stream channel and the adjacent areas to the stream, and that shows you, where the regulations would apply. So the areas that are not floodway but are still in the 100-year floodplain, we call the fringe. So it's the flood or floodway fringe, where you have to get a permit, but then the interior part of that, you see floodway. So the stream channel and its immediately adjacent areas, that's where the no-rise certification requirement applies. And then that level there in the stream channel, that's within the 100-year floodplain, so that surface elevation is the base flood elevation, or BFE. So hopefully that makes sense. And again, the SFHA is considered the high-risk flood zone on a firm. So Zone A, areas that are subject to inundation by the 100-year flood. Detailed hydraulic analysis is not performed in this area. It's called the approximate floodplain, but basically it just means that the base flood elevation has not been calculated. Those depths are estimated on the firm, but they're not calculated. So we do have a process to help people calculate what that elevation is, and we'll go over that a little bit later. But yeah, basically it's considered to be within the 100-year floodplain, but we don't know exactly what the base flood elevation is. Whereas Zone AE are also subject to inundation by the 100-year flood, but it has been determined by more detailed methods. And so we do have exactly what the base flood elevations are shown within these zones. And so we'll look closer at how that has been calculated and how it's documented in the flood insurance study in a little bit. And then it is used on new and revised maps instead of the A1 through 30. So this is what replaced the A1 through 30. And then Zone AO and AH are also subject to inundation by the 100-year flood, but it's for sheet flowing or shallow ponding. So this has average depths that are between 1 and 3 feet, and the flood depth is derived from the hydraulic analysis and are shown within this zone. So these zones have depths instead of a base flood elevation, but these are zones that are getting phased out with new mapping because they're kind of hard to regulate and they have a little bit of a loophole as far as required freeboard and that kind of thing. They're just a little bit outdated, and so these don't appear on our newer maps. And then finally, we have the areas that are not regulatory. So you have shaded zone X, and then zone X. And so these used to be known as B and C, but now we call them zone X. So you have the moderate flood hazard, so that's a 500-year floodplain. So again, still at risk from 0.2% annual chance flood. That would be from intense rainfall. So again, that's considered moderate risk, but it's not regulatory. It's not regulated on the ordinance unless you specifically adopt it. And then unshaded zone X is just everywhere else that's outside of the floodplain and considered to be at minimal risk. There's no areas that are not at risk at all. There's always risk of flooding no matter where you are, but it's considered minimal risk, and that's everywhere else that's outside of the floodplain. And so again, flood insurance is available in participating communities, but it's not required in these two zones, but available to them. So just an example of the symbology and how it looks when we do the mapping. And so this is a page from our quick guide that we updated in 2023. And this is the National Flood Hazard Layer style of mapping. And so all of the firms that are effective are the same, but depending on where you get it, they just look a little bit different. And so this is the basically FEMA's web map version of the digital mapping. And so it appears this way, and then our state viewer makes it look a little bit different, but it's all the same data and information. And then the same thing for if you do a FIRMET through the Map Service Center. So we'll look at that, but first just taking a closer look at this. So the first arrow is pointing to a cross-section location. So we looked at cross-sections a little bit already, but these are still part of the mapping process. We still have these areas where basically we're taking a slice of the floodplain, and then we know exactly right there what the base flood elevation is. This is a detailed study, so you can see the floodway there, and that's the red and blue kind of crosshatched area. And then we have a cross section G right there. It's labeled. And so we'll look at those more later and how they correspond with the flood insurance study. And then the second arrow is pointing at the AE zone. So again, a detailed area where we do have those base flood elevations calculated for these areas. It's the 100-year floodplain, again, also called the fringe. And then the base flood elevation, as I said, we know those exactly for where they are in the cross section. So that's what that's pointing to. They're often rounded on the map, so we do have to actually calculate what they are, but they are, presented on the map as a rounded number, so you get the gist of what the base flood elevation is for that area. We also have a zone A here that is adjacent to both the floodway and the AE zone. So again, it's called the approximate floodplain. We don't have the BFEs calculated. We have to go in and do a calculation for those. And then the floodway, again, the crosshatched area where the no-rise certificate has to be provided in order to develop in those areas. It's the most dangerous area of the floodplain. And then the shaded zone X, again, that's the 500-year or the 0.2% annual chance floodplain that is considered to be at moderate risk but not regulated. And then finally, we have the unshaded zone X, which is all other areas that are outside the 100-year floodplain and considered to be at low or minimal risk. Also called Zone C on older maps, but now we call it the unshaded zone X. And so this is just a little bit different style of mapping. So you can see the aerial photograph in this background is in black and white. So this looks a little bit more like if you get it off the map service center. But same thing, you have the lettered cross sections that go across the floodplain horizontally. The floodway is always mapped in cross-hatching. You have the approximate water surface elevations on the map, the detailed AE zone study, and then in that orangey brown colors, the 500 years. So it's all the same information on different formats. So the MSC, or the Map Service Center, is FEMA's official website for downloading these maps or other products. So you have the effective maps, any preliminary products that are being produced. You have the historical older maps that are no longer effective. So you can look back into the history of all the mapping that's been done for a community. You can download the firm panels, any letters of map change that are effective or revalidated in a community. You have the DFIRMs, so the digital flood insurance rate map. That's where I mentioned the format. You can basically just make a little screenshot with a legend on it that focuses on a certain area, or you can download the full firm panels again. And then the flood insurance study is also available here under effective products. And if you just want to make a small map of an area that has a digital firm, you can use the address search bar, pull it up, and then also make a map that way, depending on what you're looking for. So if you go to search all products, once you have your address typed in, you can go to show all products. Or if you go to dynamic map, that's how you can just quickly make a little map of an area. You can do either one. So yeah, and this is what happens when you go to search all products. So you can see under effective products, the firm panels, the FIS, your letters of map change that are effective, and then you can also download the National Flood Hazard Layer products. And so again, the National Flood Hazard Layer is FEMA's digital web map type of thing so we took a look at a couple of those types of maps. And so yep. So we also have the state floodplain viewer. So this is a Kansas specific web map viewer. So we maintain our state viewer, and it's a lot faster than the National Flood Hazard Layer, especially during peak hours. And we have a little bit more data available on our viewer than you might get on the Map Service Center as far as the web map goes. So you can just pull it up really quickly on the Map Service Center, but we have a little bit more detail and abilities on our state viewer. So you can draw and measure, and you can also make a quick map through that. So I highly recommend using that over the National Flood Hazard Layer. Either one's fine, but we have a little bit more and it's probably more accessible. So it displays the current effective DFIRMs and the digitized paper firms that we have. So there are areas with paper maps. We did put those on there as a layer that's available. It includes the cross sections, the BFE lines, the approximate BFEs, the low MAR letter of map revision areas, and then we have the cross section stationing. Again, includes draw and measurement tools that can help with calculating BFEs, and then the print function to export a map of an area. So a little bit more about base flood elevation significance. So new construction has to meet the currently adopted regulations, which means it has to be based on the current effective base flood elevation for that site. And so a pre-firm structure is considered a structure that was existing before the area was mapped, basically. And so it's often that we'll see those structures are not elevated to the current base flood elevation, and they don't have to meet that standard until they're substantially damaged or improved, which we'll talk more about tomorrow. But they're just predate the availability of risk data, so they weren't built to withstand that. FEMA's minimum standard is at or above the base flood elevation, but in Kansas, we have a required 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So that's the minimum elevation for the lowest floor in Kansas. So many states have a state higher standard that has to be met. And so the lowest floor of a structure, including a basement, needs to be at least 1 foot above. And so that's what's depicted on the right side. A letter of map change or a letter of map amendment specifically is known as a LOMA. So if you're eligible for that, then the lowest adjacent grade touching the foundation of the structure has to be at or above the base flood elevation. And then once you apply for that using survey data, FEMA will evaluate it and then grant you a letter of map amendment or a LOMA, which officially and legally takes you out of the floodplain. And so then you don't have to adhere to the ordinance and you don't have the mandatory purchase requirement anymore. So basically you were inadvertently mapped into the floodplain because of scaling issues, and so it should never have been included. And it's a free of charge letter. So there's no fees associated with that versus some other types of letters of map change. And we'll look at those a little bit later. So yeah, this kind of shows you how that works. So the lowest adjacent grade on the first two structures on the bottom, you can see where it touches the foundation is at or above the base flood elevation, whereas the other two structures on the right have their lowest adjacent grade below the base flood elevation. So they have portions of their foundations that touch the ground below the base flood elevation, and so they are ineligible. Okay. So Caitlin, if you want to launch our first poll question, and then we'll take a quick 5-minute break. And again, if you want credit with the certificate, then you have to respond to all the poll questions. So we'll have 2 poll questions, one at the end of this first hour, and then one at the end of the class. And then we'll ask if you would like a certificate. But give it a couple more seconds for anyone who may not have answered, but yeah, so is the 500-year floodplain regulatory? Oh, sorry, true or false? The 500-year floodplain is not regulatory, sorry. Okay, I think everyone has answered. Cool, right. The 500-year floodplain is not regulatory. It can be regulated if you choose to adopt it into your ordinance, but that's above the minimum requirements. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left in the hour, so let's take a quick break and come back at 11. Okay, continue into the second hour. So calculating a base flood elevation, we do have a training video on this as well, but I will go over the basics of it. So calculating in base flood elevation is based on the zone that you're interested in. So again, A1 through 30 is for older studies. AE, AO, and AH are published and can be found using the firm and the flood insurance study, which again is the report that's developed along with the firm to demonstrate how all of the data was collected and used to make the map, as well as some history on that community and their flooding sources and that kind of stuff. So again, the Zone A does not have published base flood elevations, but you can use best available data to make that determination. So we do have a portal to request that we go ahead and calculate these areas for you. And we do use the data from either the developed firm that's not published, or we have newer data depending on what the request is for. So the BFE can be obtained from the flood insurance study in Zone A, AE. So we'll look more at the portal in a little bit. But the floodway data table and the flood profiles are what we use to both calculate and check our work. But the floodway data tables themselves have a lot of really useful data if you're interested in looking more in depth at what the firm is saying about these flooding sources based on the cross sections. And then if you have like a lacustrine lake or reservoir, the base flood elevation is taken from the summary of still water elevations on the FIS. And so again, if you're looking at a lake or a reservoir that you need, that's where you should get your base flood elevation, and there's no calculating that needs to be done. It's just provided for you on that still water elevation table. So this process of calculating is for the riverine areas, which is what we have more of. So basically, every stream that has been considered to be in the 100-year flood plain has been graphed out basically in these flood profiles. So towards the end of the FIS, you have each of these flooding sources graphed out in this way. And so it just shows you on a graph what the elevations are for the stream bed, the different flood frequencies, and then it also shows you where the cross sections are located in relationship to that stream. And so this is the best source of information on BFEs for a stream. And so the floodway data table tells you what the base flood elevation is for each of those cross sections. And so that's what we're using to do this calculation. So those elevations are listed in that table, and then you have the cross sections kind of mapped out here on this graph of the stream. And so the BFE value is only accurate for areas that are on the actual cross section. So if you're looking for a site that's in between those cross sections, like we looked at earlier at that one structure, then we have to interpolate that value based on the two cross sections that it's in between. And so this is how we use the flood profile to calculate the base flood elevations between two cross sections. So step one is to locate your structure of interest that you're interested in calculating. And so in this example, we have a community center in Topeka. And so this is kind of how it looks in the base flood elevation portal. Once you're in there, you go to the map, you find your structure, and you draw as accurate as you can a polygon around that structure. And that's how we receive the request. So when we're doing this process, once we've located the most upstream portion of the structure, so in this case, it's kind of that top left corner that is the most upstream for that structure, you draw a line from that point on the structure and draw a perpendicular line until it intersects the streamline. So we have in our firms that we develop, and you can see this on the state floodplain viewer. There is a profile baseline. So this is the like centermost line that goes along the stream. And so this is what's used to calculate the base flood elevation. And it can be kind of tricky to draw a line that is perpendicular. There's really not any guidance on how that's done, but it should be perpendicular to the streamline. And so there might be a little bit of variation on that, but when we calculate it, we have multiple people look at each of our calculations to ensure that they're accurate. But this is how it's meant to be done. It is in the MT1 guidance as far as this process, but there's just a little bit of skill to getting it right. But step 3 is to determine which of those closest cross-section or roads or bridges are often part of the FIS that can also be referenced for doing these, but typically we're going to be using the cross sections. So you can see here we have DB and DC, and our point of interest is right in between these two cross sections. And so DB is the closest cross section. And yeah, roads and bridges are also mapped or graphed onto the flood profile and are used as reference points, but you can just stick to the cross sections. So then we're going to measure along that streamline. So the profile baseline, we measure that from that cross section to our building cross section, which is the line that we drew from the building. So that distance is what we're going to use to determine our base flood elevation using the flood profile. So this is an ARC Pro. It has a measuring tool. As I mentioned, our state viewer also has a measuring tool. And so you take that distance, which in this case is 160 feet upstream of cross-section DB on that flood profile. So then you go find the Chunkanunga Creek flood profile in the FIS. So make sure that you're using the appropriate flood profile and then find where that cross section is on the bottom. So the x-axis is the distance along the stream. So you want to find the correct cross section, so make sure you're using the right one, and then measure that distance, which again in this example is 160 feet, measure upstream of that cross section on this graph. And so some of them may have different intervals between these larger boxes, but basically it shows you the distance along the stream and where the cross sections are located. So just whatever that distance is that you measured, measure it on the flood profile, and then mark that point. So it's almost on this line right here where that red line hits the gray one. That's our point of interest. And so once you find that point, just draw a line straight up all the way through the different flood frequencies. And then there is this little legend that tells you which one is the 100-year flood, or again, the 1% annual chance flood. That's the one that we want. That's what the base flood elevation is. So where this red line that we've drawn intersects right there with the 100-year flood, that's our base flood elevation. So once you have hit that point, then you can draw another line going all the way to the left, and that will tell you what the base flood elevation is. So again, where it intersects with the 100-year flood, you go all the way over and it tells you what that number is, depending on what the intervals are on the y-axis, but it's typically like 1 foot per every line. So yeah, then you just read the flood elevation. So the y-axis is the ground elevation in reference to a datum, which is likely to be NAVD 88. The older ones may be an NGVD 29, but we don't use that anymore for the newer maps. So in this example, the base flood elevation for that structure is 933.9 feet. and some floodplain administrators would go ahead and just round it up to 934, which is fine, just to make sure that that lowest floor is built high enough, and a little bit extra elevation's not too expensive if it hasn't been built yet, and it just makes sure that they're properly elevated. So zone AH and zone AO base flood elevations, again, these are either in the table of still water elevations because these are the depths, or it's on the firm. And again, these are 1 to 3 feet, so they're as far as depth goes, these shallow flooding areas. So yeah, the firm uses BFE lines or static elevation parentheses. So they're simple to find. There's no calculating to do, but again, these are being phased out on new maps, so you're likely to see less and less of them. So zone AO are approximate floodplain. So the modeling doesn't include the detailed structure information, and those base flood elevations are not published. So you can reasonably utilize best available data. So sometimes projects like KDOT, they might have calculated this, or other like state availability. So it used to be the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers would calculate this for you, but it costs quite a bit of money. But we have access to the base flood elevations from previous studies. We have the base level engineering that we sometimes use depending on the situation, or draft data from an ongoing mapping project. So we have these different resources that we can utilize, and we use the base flood elevation portal to formally process these requests. So if you do have a project in a zone A, this is the preferred format that we use, so we can see exactly where the information is needed. And so that's the link down at the bottom. You can just Google Kansas Base Flood Elevation Portal and it should pop up. So you can register for an account. And then there's a mapping tab where you go and draw a polygon on your structure or your area of interest, like the screenshots that I showed you before. And then we will provide the approximate lowest adjacent grade from the LiDAR, as well as the calculated base flood elevation in a letter that gets sent to you and whoever the floodplain administrator is for that community. And so depending on what you are asking for, what the project is, we'll use different data sources, and then we may also have some clarifying questions about your request, but we do get those sent out within 5 days of the request being submitted. So yeah, it's a very helpful service and a lot of people use it frequently. So if you weren't aware of that, you can go set up an account. And then we have letters of map change. So letters of map change are basically either FEMA commenting on a specific area on the firm or officially revising the firm due to either work that's been done or other types of requests submitted. So basically, we have different revisions and amendments to the maps that are there and they're valid, but we don't do like a full mapping update to reflect these changes. We have this process instead. So we have a couple of basic types like the LOMA, which again proves that an area is naturally elevated at or above the base flood elevation, either for a structure or a section of property that you want to take out of the official floodplain. Or we have the letter of map revision based on fill. So an area that is to be developed on fill, where you raise the natural ground level artificially through earth and fill to at or above the base flood elevation, then you can get a LOMAR F that will again officially take you out of the floodplain. The initial construction has to comply with the ordinance, but future work will not. It officially takes you out of the floodplain and removes the mandatory purchase requirement. And then the more extensive and larger types of project, you have the LOMAR, or the letter of map revision. So these are not for like individual property owners. These are typically larger projects that expand multiple properties. Um, and on that, some kind of work has been done that alters the base flood elevation, either increasing or decreasing. And so it's a larger project that has a substantial impact on that area floodplain. And so these actually go through the community, and usually a developer, and like we're typically involved in a LOMAR, whereas those other two simpler processes are usually just a property owner, a surveyor, or an engineer, and then the online portal submission that FEMA has for LOMAs and LOMARFs. Whereas again, the LOMAR is a bigger like community level project. It's not a personal property type of thing. A conditional letter of map revision is required when the base flood elevation is proposed to increase. There's all these notification requirements where you have to notify property owners that their base flood elevation is increasing, which is not typical. What I've seen usually is where the developers are able to do a project and lower the base flood elevation, which is obviously more favorable, and it doesn't necessarily remove an area from the 100-year flood. It can just be altering the floodplain. But again, those are larger scale projects. And if you're curious to learn more about LOMARs, we do have a couple of our contractors that have done presentations on how these are submitted. And it's a very long, complicated, and technical process. But we do have training on that if you're interested, and that's on our YouTube channel, and you can also find it on our training page that links to the channel. But for the most part, it's a letter that states whether a project would be removed from the floodplain if built as proposed. Most of the time, sometimes it doesn't get removed, that's all. Sometimes it changes the floodplain, that's all. And then the forms for these, so for LOMAs or a LOMA out as shown, so for a single lot or structure, if it's residential and we're talking about natural grade and it's not in the floodway, you can use the MTEZ, which is a shortened version of the MT1 application. So it's very simple and straightforward. Usually a surveyor will fill that out. I will get a little bit more into the LOMA out as shown, but you don't need a survey for that. So if you have a LOMA that is not residential for multiple properties, or if you actually qualify for a LOMA in the floodway, then the surveyor or the engineer has to use the MT1 application forms. Yeah, multiple lots, commercial, or if any fill has been placed for a low MAR F, that's the MT1 application, and then CLOMARs and LOMARs are the MT2 applications. Again, changes to the base flood elevation or an alteration of the floodway, that's where that would apply in those larger types of projects. And then you have to have, a lot of engineering work that goes into that. Okay. So again, the LOMA, or letter of map amendment, states that an existing lot or structure that has not been elevated by fill, it's on the natural ground, would not be inundated by the 100-year flood. And so it shouldn't have been included in the map, but because of the way we have to scale things, sometimes structures or properties accidentally get included, but the lowest adjacent grade is at or above the base flood elevation, so it's not in the floodplain. And then again, that takes away the mandatory purchase requirement and the requirement to follow the ordinance. And then the LOMA out as shown is another case that happens. So usually this is a case where a property has floodplain on it, but it's not touching any of the structures, or at least the residential structure. Sometimes you'll have a lender, so the mortgage provider has these third-party determination companies that just run it through a computer program, and if there's any floodplain on the property, they count it as being in the floodplain. But technically, if the structure is located outside of that mapped floodplain, even if portions of that property is in, it's actually not considered to be in the floodplain. So this is something a property owner can do on their own. There's very simple instructions to follow that I can provide, but we also have that on our website, or you can look it up. FEMA has it all laid out, but basically they just fill out part of the MTEZ form. They attach a map, and then they submit that to FEMA, and they can get a letter of map amendment out as shown. And that will take away any mandatory purchase requirement issues they might be having, even though they're not actually in the floodplain. So those are the two options for the LOMA there. And then we kind of just refer people to the Kansas Society of Land Surveyors. We're not allowed to recommend any one person for that. We have had some floodplain administrators that will give people a list of surveyors that have attended our training on elevation certificates or basics of the NFIP or letters of map change. So all of these topics, we do have other classes that have broken them out more specifically if you're interested in those. But we typically just refer people to this Society of Licensed Surveyors so that they can find people in their area that can service wherever they're located to do an elevation certificate or help with a LOMA or LOMAR-F. So this is a good resource, and then they can speak with people that can service their area and get those quotes and stuff like that. We do have like a one-page recommendation sheet about how to talk to surveyors and find someone that has the experience that you're looking for and that kind of thing. So the letter of map revision based on fill, one important difference here is that you have a separate and third form on the MT1 application, which is the community acknowledgement form. And so the floodplain administrator has to sign off that the project is meeting the local ordinance requirements. And so this is an attempt for FEMA to close a loophole that had been causing issues where people would build a fill pad, get a LOMAR-F and take it out of the floodplain, and then dig into that fill pad and put in a basement below the base flood elevation. And so FEMA wanted to prevent this by adding this form that says the floodplain administrator is signing off on the fact that the proposed development that goes on top of that fill is going to meet the standards of the adopted ordinance. And so definitely don't sign off on any letter of map revision based on fill applications unless you have reviewed the plans for that development, because people will often do that. A lot of people want to build basements in the floodplain, and it's not a good idea. So FEMA has been trying to prevent that. And so when you sign off on that form, you're ensuring that you have reviewed that development and that it will comply, which still means having the lowest floor at least a foot above the base flood elevation. So just be aware of that. This is quite different from a LOMA, because we're looking at a structure or a parcel of land that has been artificially elevated on fill, and so that it would not be inundated by the 1% annual chance flood. So the top of that fill has to be at or above the base flood elevation. The lowest floor that they build on top of that has to be at least 1 foot above. So a state permit is required when fill is brought into the floodplain, and that is on average greater than 1 foot in depth of fill. And so our stream obstructions team works on floodplain fill applications. So the community acknowledgement form also says that you have verified that other federal and state permits have been acquired when they're needed. So that would be another part of reviewing this type of application, is making sure they got a state fill permit. And Janelle Phillips with our office usually helps us do the determinations on whether or not a fill permit is required for a given project. And then again, our state higher standard is that the lowest floor is still 1 foot above the BFE, whereas the FEMA standard is just at or above the base flood elevation, and they don't really look at the higher standards, but the requirement based on the application form is that you have reviewed and made sure that it's still meeting your minimum standards adopted in your ordinances. So we're not trying to get around higher standards and basements because they're generally not allowed in the process of getting the Lomar F. What they do after they build something is, difficult. So, no one's going to build a fill pad and not do anything with it. The intention of putting in fill is to build something on it. So that's why you need to review that and then still do the inspections and make sure that it's actually compliant with the plans that they submitted to you to make sure that they are still in compliance with the conditions of that Lomar F, but it does get into a little gray area once the Lomar F has been granted that they're no longer in the floodplain and they can kind of just do what they want. But there is at least this precursory effort to ensure compliance still. And there is a fee associated with that. As I said, the LOMA does not have a fee. The LOMAR F, where you're changing the topography and the map a little bit, there's a fee associated with that. And you can also get a CLOMAR F, which is a conditional letter of map revision based on fill. And that ensures that if you build as proposed, it will get approved. And so you do have that option, or property owners have that option to ensure that their Lomar F will be approved. So if you don't get approved, they will send you a denial letter and it will be documented that an application was denied, and then sometimes that will bring up violations that we then have to present to the community and resolve. So just being aware of that. Again, the LOMA is an amendment to the firm that is issued to the property owner once they provide survey information that their natural ground elevation is at or above the BFE, and then the lender can waive their flood insurance requirement once that building is removed from the SFHA because the natural ground at that site is above the base flood elevation. However, lenders sometimes will require flood insurance regardless of your flood zone. So that's also something for property owners to be aware of. If that's their whole goal and the lender still requires it, then there's really no reason to do that. The letter of map revision based on fill, it's an official revision, so not an amendment. It revises the firm, and that is issued based on FEMA's determination that a structure or parcel has been elevated by fill above the base flood elevation and no longer subject to the base flood. And then that might take away the insurance requirement if it's not already required by the lender. So these areas might look the same, but one is natural, one is artificial fill. And again, that's why the Lomar F has a charge. So again, with the out as shown, so in this case, you can see the structure is not mapped into the floodplain, but the property owner got a lender noticed that they are requiring flood insurance because of their flood zone. Again, the determination company are not looking through the actual images or maps to determine who is in the special flood hazard area. They're just looking at it as being on the property. So this is that process where the property owners don't need a surveyor. They can just follow the out as shown instructions and get that taken off by the lender. Yeah, and I do have that list of instructions. It's very simple and straightforward. So again, the LOMAR officially revises the firm to show changes to the floodplains, floodways, or flood elevations on a bigger community-wide scale. I mean, that area might not be for the entire community, but like a large section spanning multiple properties, where there are significant changes to the flood zone or flooding characteristics, hydrology, bridges, stream channelization, retention, and detention basins, which are those larger projects where usually a community is working with a contractor and a developer to make a large change to the areas of floodplain that change the hydrology. The CLOMAR is sometimes required, sometimes not, but it's a letter from FEMA that commenting on the proposed project, if built as proposed, would justify a LOMAR or the proposed hydrology changes. So yeah, this is filed when, upon construction, the effect on the hydrology and hydraulics will significantly change those characteristics. We do have another separate viewer that is for letters of map change. You can see them issued since 2000 for your community. So most of them are LOMAs, but we do have the CLOMA, CLOMAR-F, and the ones that are denied are also mapped on there, just so you know when those were issued and applied for. Again, the state viewer does show the areas that are impacted by a LOMAR. However, like a LOMAR-F for a property, we don't have those boundaries. You would have to look at the actual document and see those meets and bounds descriptions in there for the land. We can potentially get that mapped out if you ever needed it, but yeah, so that's how this works. And you can pull up the documents on the map, which is convenient. You can look through your city to see where all the LOMAs are located. And just so you know, some people don't realize their letter has been denied and they think it's been accepted because they get something back that looks exactly like an approved LOMA or LOMA-RF, but it has a dash and it says DEN, and that means denied. And so they're not really distinguishable from the others aside from that. So it's just something to be aware of, that they look very similar, but if it says DEN, that's denied. And so because they look so similar, some people have not realized that it actually wasn't approved. And again, that can trigger violations that FEMA lets us know about, and then we assist the community to resolve those. You can also see the historic ones under historic products on the Map Service Center. So now we'll go into some of the types of projects that require permits and look at the regulations a little bit. So for the most part, communities use our model ordinance that we have, which is based on the Code of Federal Regulations that has the NFIP federal minimum requirements in it. So the Code of Federal Regulations Title 40 and then 60.3 has the specific requirements there. So it's listed 60.3 A through E. And so these are the different levels of ordinance that we have. So we have a model ordinance that corresponds to each one of those. So at the A level, there is no map. The B level, you only have the approximate A zones and nothing else. At C, you have a firm that has AE zones on it. So the areas with the base flood elevations, you might also have A zones in that. And then D, somewhere in your firm, you have floodway. So if you have floodway, you're likely to also have AE zones and A zones. So all of those different levels. And then we don't have E zones because those are the coastal high hazard areas, which we don't have. But those are called V zones, so we don't use those regulations, but we have A through D levels. So again, these are the minimum requirements established by the federal government for floodplain construction when a community participates in the NFIP. And then we also have some state regulations. So when a community decides to join the NFIP and they have a map to adopt, what happens is basically the areas of floodplain become their own zone. And so because they are considered zones, the Kansas zoning regulations apply. So we have state-specific requirements for zoning regulations that are then incorporated into the floodplain regulations. And so we have all of that written into our model ordinances. And so once a community is updating their ordinance or entering the program for the first time, we always have to evaluate the ordinance. So we have a responsibility to review all draft ordinances before they can be adopted. And that is written into the state laws that any floodplain management ordinance has to be reviewed and approved by the chief engineer through KDA to be able to adopt and be legally enforceable. And so that has been delegated to us on the floodplain team. So that's me and Caitlin. We have the authority to review and approve ordinances, and then we further assist communities with the adoption process. So you have the Kansas administrative regulations, and then there's some Kansas state like statutes that also apply. So it gets a little bit complicated where the federal and state regulations intersect, but we do have all of our models reviewed by FEMA prior to presenting them to communities, and our legal team also reviews them. Because like I said, right now we're in the process of developing a base level engineering ordinance to be able to adopt that type of non-regulatory product. And so we're going to have, well, we're working with a contractor to develop it, and then FEMA and our legal team will review those. So just a little background on how regulations work in the state. So your ordinance is the foundation for the need to issue floodplain development permits. So what it says is any development, which is any change to real or unreal real estate, like the phrasing is so that any change to any part of the floodplain is considered development and requires a permit. So there is a little bit of leeway with that, depending on what it is, because floodplain management does require some judgment calls from time to time. But this is your document that authorizes you through the state of Kansas to enforce your regulations, resolve violations, to charge people with fines, to take them to court if you have to in the more extreme situations. We do have a full class on just doing violations and resolving them with property owners. But again, our current template was released in June of 2023. And I meant to update this. So the new permit template is has been released. So I'll send that out on our NFIP resources page. So I'm sorry I missed that, but yes, the permit template has been released. So we also updated our floodplain development permit template into something a little bit more guided. And so we made it in a way to try to guide you through how to permit development if you're not super experienced. It should, we have it in like a smart PDF format, and so yeah, it's meant to be guided, and it'll show you on the checklist what all's required for the different types of development that you've checked. But basically, again, a permit is required for all development in the SFHA that's on the firm, and that means any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate. So the structural for sure on the left side here, that's the most important because we're constructing new buildings or putting additions on existing buildings, the placement of manufactured homes, the placement of new accessory agricultural or temporary structures are included in what's considered structural. So that's walled and roofed with at least 2 rigid walls and a roof attached is the basic definition of a structure. And so anytime you have a new structure, a finished elevation certificate is required for that. So that's new buildings or substantial improvements, which again, we'll get into more tomorrow, but there are certain exemptions to that, but in general, that's what's required. Other types of development do not require an elevation certificate. The elevation certificate is only for structures. So other things that are built have much less like rigid requirements for siting and elevating. Basically, they have to be made of flood damage resistant material and not cause an obstruction, depending on what it is. So roads, bridges, and culverts, usually that's stuff that are larger projects in the community, but you also have fill, grading, excavation, mining, drilling, and dredging, the type of stuff that will require a state permit. Definitely altering stream channels is a big deal and will require multiple state and federal permits. Land clearing is usually pretty straightforward. Temporary or permanent materials that are stored have to be either anchored or readily removable in the event of a flood. Improvements to existing structures that will require an elevation certificate if it was a substantial improvement that had to be elevated. But if it's a minor improvement, it's a simple permit. Removing structures, a very simple permit, and then other simple permits for stuff like open carports, playgrounds, fences, gazebos, outdoor seating. They just have to be anchored and made of flood damage resistant materials, and we ensure that they are by issuing a permit. And again, the no rise certification is required for any development that is located within a floodway. So this is the new template that we have. So we've split up the different types of development so that it's a step-by-step process, like what type of structural development is it? Residential, non-residential, a manufactured home, etc. Or is it non-structural and it's like we're putting in fill, we're paving something, it's just a fence or utility work. And so we've separated them in that way. And then channel improvements, definitely you are notified, like if you check that box, it will tell you like that you probably need state and federal permits to be able to do something like that. If it's a regulated stream, you definitely will. So that we have work that's specific to channel improvements, and then modification type. Is it new construction? Are you repairing or rehabilitating something? And then we'll look into whether that's substantial, so 50% or more of the market value. Again, we'll talk more about that tomorrow, but it's a guided template that leads you through the process depending on the type of project it is, on what those requirements are. So we wanted it to be more guided just to help new floodplain administrators. The previous template we had down here where you fill it out, but it doesn't guide you through what the requirements are. So there's a lot more instruction and like information on the new permit template. So I mentioned exemptions. Again, the ordinance says all development must be permitted. You can exempt very small projects from needing a permit because it would be tedious and unnecessary to project every little thing, such as planting a garden, putting in a mailbox or a flagpole, routine maintenance to the roof. So that's the type of thing that we're looking at that won't cause an obstruction. And just a note on that, replacing a roof is different from re-shingling a roof. And so that's what we're referring to. And then this should be written down, put it in writing, what exactly is exempted, and put that in your written administrative procedures. So be extremely clear and precise about what is exempted and what's not. And so that there's no possibility of a misunderstanding where a substantial improvement happens without being permitted or an obstruction is caused. So we want to avoid any challenges to decision making. saying that it's arbitrarily made or something by a permitting official. No, we have explicitly listed what types of projects can be exempted. Um, and then everything else needs a permit. And then coordination, you should identify the other departments in your community that need to review these decisions, these permits, which could be health, electrical, stuff like that. And that way you have some kind of routing and sign-off procedures that will help us avoid any miscommunication, to work in conjunction to make sure that no permits are issued until every department is satisfied with the work that's going on. And that way you don't get like a certificate of occupancy for a structure that was just built with the floor too low. That's the kind of thing we want to avoid. And then you should be able to advise your applicants on state or federal permits. Of course, we're always here to help. And then notify us of any type of large projects that would alter or relocate a water course. So I did just do a whole series on elevation certificates, but basically this is the form that is used for verifying compliance with your ordinance based on these different structural characteristics. So these are for new or substantially improved structures to document the lowest floor and making sure there's adequate flood openings and that the machinery and equipment is elevated properly and that kind of thing. So again, we did just do this in-depth training, but just as an overview, Section C has some of the most important information as far as like the top of the bottom floor. Again, it has to be at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And then the top of the next higher floor, you also have the lowest adjacent grade next to the building, which we discussed at the bottom under C2F. And so they now have you indicate whether that's natural or finished. And so this is what you'd be evaluating this information once it's been given to you by a surveyor or an engineer. And then it tells you what the base flood elevation is, which should be calculated either by us or by them using the flood profile or the BFE portal, or however that's done. They indicate in the comments usually, or what the source is there in B10, like how it was determined, and then you should double check that. Section G is new, so anytime you get a new elevation certificate, you should fill this section out. So it tells you what the purpose is. So it has a permitting purpose that you're filling this out, or you're making a correction to an elevation certificate. So they've really improved the instructions on this form. So if you're ever in doubt, that you can look at that. But here's section G9A, the elevation of the as-built lowest floor, including a basement. So you are verifying that here in this section. So you can look at section C where it was recorded, or section H if it's just for an insurance policy. But yeah, and then you always have the building diagrams that show you where the lowest floor is for the type of foundation that you have. So you'd want to, verify that they've picked the right diagram for section A, and then verify that the lowest floor, including a basement, is at or above 1 foot above the BFE. So again, the same thing, just it also shows you where the lowest adjacent grade is located, and deck or stairs, which is also part of it. The lowest floor of an enclosure, which is different from the lowest floor usually, but that goes a little bit into permitting and stuff. But enclosures below the lowest floor. So these are areas that are only used for parking, storage, and building access. So it could be like a garage, it could be a crawl space, but basically these are wet flood proofed with flood openings that you have at least 2 on 2 different sides with 1 square inch of net space for every enclosed foot of enclosed space. So yeah, there's requirements for enclosures, but they're not considered the lowest floor if they're compliant. And so in section A, A8A and A8B, you have The information about the flood openings. Again, section H and I are just for insurance policies. So either you or the property owner can fill that out, and it just kind of verifies where the first floor above grade is on their structure. And then the risk rating engine and the insurance person works with them on that. For first floor height, that's what they call it for insurance. If they have the surveyed information, they can just take that data from section C, and then they will use that instead of the risk rating engine if it benefits them, but that goes a little bit more into insurance, which I mentioned, risk rating 2.0. This is the new rating methodology that was released in 2021. So basically, FEMA no longer requires survey data to issue an insurance policy. They have their way of now rating structures without needing that. But it's a little convoluted on exactly how a premium is calculated, and it hasn't necessarily improved insurance overall as people continue to drop their policies, but it's kind of difficult to tell where the intersection between increased premiums and maybe the black box effect of the risk rating engine, which we don't have access to, how all of that is interacting. But yep. And then construction. So again, any construction in the floodway needs a no-rise certificate. And so again, that is a study done by an engineer that proves that the new construction is not going to cause any rise whatsoever in the base flood elevation. And so then they sign and seal that. So they certify it by a registered professional engineer. And so we do have information on our website about using the effective model and what kind of methodology should be used to determine this. I think we have some training on this through our contractors, but more or less you can review the work, and if you're not an engineer, it can be difficult, but ultimately that engineer is putting their seal on it. They put their licensing on ensuring that it's correct. So that's kind of what we refer to if you get a no-rise certification. Basically, they're kind of responsible for ensuring that their work is accurate. Right. So again, we talked a little bit about elevatings. So in the example on the left, it's a crawl space. So again, that's considered an enclosure. It has the flood openings that allows water to freely move in and out of that area. And then the lowest floor would be the living floor that is above that crawl space, as long as it's compliant. And then we talked about elevating on fill. When people get Lomar Fs, it's similar to that. So this is a slab on grade structure with the lowest floor. That living floor is elevated on fill at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So different types of ways to elevate a structure, just depending on the situation and how they would prefer to elevate it. We do have regulations for floodplain fill. And so again, that is a separate permit through the state, through our stream obstructions team. So they evaluate these, and there are certain conditions. So the fill has to be sloped in a certain way. There's vegetation requirements to reduce erosion and machine compaction, and they want it to be nice, clean, homogeneous soil that is not made with large rocks or construction debris. Again, basements are not allowed for important reasons, that when you have an area below ground like that and it floods in these high-risk areas, you do have that hydrostatic pressure pushing against the walls and the floors that can cause significant structural damage. It can be repaired, but if it's a substantial enough damage that it hits the threshold, that again we'll talk about more tomorrow, then they would have to fill in that basement and elevate the house. And that's really one of the most difficult situations to deal with in floodplain management because people really don't want to hear that they have to elevate their home and fill in a basement, but those are the requirements. And so in the left example, a window in the basement has broken and now that area is flooded. And in the other one, the walls or the floor could collapse. Again, significant damage there. So that's why they're not allowed in the SFHA. Again, another crawl space diagram. So the floor of the crawl space is at or above the outside grade. Otherwise, it could be considered a basement, which would be a violation. At least 2 flood openings on different sides, and then no more than 1 foot above ground. And then you have your lowest living floor above that, again, at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. It's also important to elevate utilities. So machinery and equipment is required to be at least above the base flood elevation. And so that's the minimum requirement there. And there's different ways of elevating them, such as a platform, or just, adhere to a wall, that kind of stuff. But they do have to be elevated. And that includes ductwork that has to be elevated at least 1 foot above. It's considered, or sorry, above the BFE because it's considered utilities. And then there's certain machinery and equipment freeboard requirements if you're part of the CRS program and you're in a class 8 or higher. Little side part right there. So utility services outside the building must be anchored and elevated high enough. So definitely don't recommend anything being on the ground. It should be firmly anchored to a platform of some kind and then elevated. So manufactured homes are kind of their own thing. They are their own type of construction and they are not as formidable as traditional construction. So there's special requirements for them. There is a guide on protecting manufactured homes from floods and that kind of thing on the bottom left there. That publication is helpful, but our ordinances have a whole section on manufactured homes. So obviously that lowest floor has to be elevated at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation, but there's also information about elevating utilities and securely anchoring that frame to the ground. Like it has to be firmly anchored. And so there are like over top ties or there's ground engineered anchors that can be used. And so that guide has more information on that. And then there's just basic requirements in the ordinance. I mentioned exemptions to getting elevation certificates. We do have those for accessory and agricultural structures. So for this appurtenant structure, like a shed, it's not habitable, it's firmly anchored, it has flood openings, it's made of flood damage resistant material, any utilities are elevated, it's only used for storage or parking, it's 600 square feet or less, and not ever modified in the future. Then it can be permitted only and would not require an elevation certificate if it meets all those requirements. An agricultural structure can meet those same requirements and also be just permitted, but it would need a variance to allow for that type of structure. So there's so much variation in what an agricultural structure is that we have to evaluate it using a variance, but if it meets those same requirements and it's not going to be potentially dangerous, it can also be built at grade with flood openings and be allowed. So this is everything that we covered today. Sorry, I rushed a little bit at the end. We started to run out of time, but we will get on with our last couple of poll questions here and then answer any questions. Again, if you want a certificate, we have a question for that, but if you attended both hours and you answer both of these poll questions, then you can get a certificate. If you want to launch that, Caitlin. Okay, so what is the minimum elevation requirement of the lowest floor of structures in Kansas at or above the BFE? at or below the BFE, 1 foot above or 2 feet above. And then just oh, I can't. Okay. Our last slide here just has our contact information. If you come up with questions later, we're always here to help. And then if you have questions about state permitting, Janelle is the obstruction team lead. Okay, it looks like everyone participated, and yes, most people got that right. The Kansas minimum requirement is 1 foot above the base flood elevation. At or above BFE is the federal minimum standard, so the higher standard in the state takes precedence. And then we have one last question about certificates, and then we can wrap it up. I will stop sharing my screen.
I think we actually have one more content-related question.
Oh, that's for part 2 tomorrow.
Okay. I will launch the certificate question then.
So yeah, I will follow up these both presentations with a follow-up email that has some of those resources and the slides in there. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, yeah, we had a couple
Okay.
questions in the chat, but I think you're about to start reading those.
Yeah. Okay. I see that you mentioned the 2019 ordinance. That was the one before. A permit is required for utility poles, but it can usually just all of them be done on one permit, and it's pretty straightforward. There's usually not any concerns with that unless it was in the floodway. And then, yeah, with Maze, I think I was talking with WSP about the floodway concerns. So it does require a no rise in the floodway, but we're kind of talking about what data can be used, and they're looking at maybe using the 2D data for that. But yeah, it does require a permit, yes. Okay, so I think everyone has answered about getting a certificate, so I will get those out probably in the next couple of days. And then if you'd like to join us tomorrow for the other 2 CECs, we will meet again at 10 o'clock. But I appreciate everyone being here and taking the time to train on this stuff. So have a great rest of your day. And yep, okay.